The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hi, everyone. I am so sorry for being late. This is Karen at the League of American Bicyclists. If you can see my screen right now, you can see what the problem was. I have now been able to I had someone else at the League log in, so thank you to Amelia for that. And I will now get started with the webinar. So again, so sorry for starting so late. But I appreciate you all hanging in there. All right, so let's get started. Let's see. So on this, today we're going to talk about the issues and the bills that we're going to be lobbying on next week at the summit, next Wednesday. So I am going to go over, first of all, I'm going to set the scene on what's happening in Washington, and then I'm going to talk about the 3 asks. We're going to have an ask on the infrastructure package because that's the big thing happening right now. We're going to have an ask on Tiger and maintaining funding for that grant program that has been really great for biking and walking. And we're going to have an ask on a bill in the House, 4241, which would provide better data to states and MPOs. Then I'm going to talk about the handouts, and then we'll go into Q&A. So again, thank you all for waiting. Just in case you didn't see last week's webinar, where we talked about how to prepare for lobbying and how to answer questions if you get into any sticky situations, how to get out of those, that is on the website now at, if you just type in bikeleague.org and click on the logo, you'll see a blog on the webinar. You can download the webinar or just flip through the slides. Quickly, we went over the 3 rules of lobbying, which was to be prepared, to be polite, and to be persistent. We talked about what kind of research you can do ahead of time to see what your senators and your representatives have said about infrastructure or transportation. You can check out their websites, look for their issues, look at VoteSmart. That will let you search any of their recent speeches, or just look in the local newspaper, do a search on Google. If you can connect what we're talking about to something that they've talked about recently, it will definitely impress both the staff and the member. All right, so now let's set the scene on what's happening in Washington. So first of all, we've had a lot of big events. I wrote this month, it's really been about 6 weeks, but one, the White House released their infrastructure plan. Everyone in Washington in the Capitol was saying, oh, we don't want to release our plan until we see what the president says. We want to wait for the president's plan. So now that's out. So hopefully that means things in the House and the Senate can start moving as well. The chairman of the House Transportation and Infrastructure Committee, Representative Bill Schuster, announced that he's going to retire. He's not going to run again, but he's still in charge of the committee for the rest of the year. And he came out in favor of a gas tax, which was a big deal. He said when he retired that he felt that if he was running for re-election, it would be hard for him to shepherd through an infrastructure deal. But now that he's retired, he's talking about the gas tax, and he was followed by President Trump indicating he would support a 25 cents a gallon gas tax increase. That would more than double the gas tax. But just so you know, the way that would probably happen is, say, a penny a month for 2 years. And then tomorrow, Secretary Elaine Chao will be testifying in the Senate Environment and Public Works Committee on the infrastructure plan and what the administration wants, what she'll be pushing. This will only be a couple of days before she speaks to us at the National Bike Summit. So it'll be really interesting to see what she says and how the members of the committee respond to it. Other signs that have been happening in the last month or so. The U.S. Chamber of Commerce is calling for a 25 cents a gallon increase in the gas tax. And the American Trucking Association also said they would support a gas tax. They said 20 cents a gallon. Either of those are really big news. For the last 2 or 3 years, I think, or 2 Congresses, Representative Earl Blumenauer has had a bill out to increase the gas tax. He talked about increasing it by 8 or 15 cents. And he sort of got the ball rolling, but now we're seeing people from both sides saying, hey, we really got to do something about funding. We're also seeing a lot of interest, a lot of momentum around this idea of an infrastructure plan. And on March 7th, when we're up on the Hill lobbying, we won't be the only ones. The Infrastructure Working Group is having a big lobby day. The Infrastructure Working Group is run by the National Association of Manufacturers and the Associated General Contractors. So it's a lot of companies, it's a lot of business associations. They're going to be up there just arguing for increased investment in infrastructure writ large. But they're going to be joined by all kinds of different interests, different associations, different businesses. And so we have this great opportunity to leverage their message and just make sure that biking and walking is part of this conversation moving forward. So I'm going to go through quickly what you need to know about the Trump infrastructure plan. And if you have questions through this, start writing them down. I'll take a short break after we talk about the Trump infrastructure plan to answer questions. So let's first talk about the funding. For those of you who've been following transportation policy, at least at the federal level, for a little while, you know that the biggest issue has been the ability to fund transportation, that the Highway Trust Fund, which is basically it's like a bank account, and all of the gas tax revenue goes into it, and the only thing it can fund going out is transportation projects. This fund has been in the middle of a funding crisis. We're not raising enough money in gas tax to pay for the transportation funding that we're putting out. And so for the last 2 bills, MAP 21 in 2012, and then the FAST Act, which just passed in 2015, Congress put general funding into the Highway Trust Fund to pay for transportation. And all the transportation experts, like Mr. Schuster, really feel like we need to find a sustainable long-term funding source. And most of them will tell you we need to at least start with the gas tax because that's in place and we know how to do it. There may be other options moving into the future. So this Trump infrastructure package, it does not address that funding crisis. It's a one-time $200 billion infusion of cash, although that $200 billion happens over 10 years. And to give you an idea of what $200 billion is, we spend $53 billion a year on transportation, but this $200 billion is not just going for transportation, it's going for wastewater and drinking water and stormwater and broadband and cleaning up Superfund sites and brownfield sites. There's a ton of uses. So $20 billion a year, I mean, $20 billion is real money, right? But it's not a ton of money when you're talking about the kind of projects that infrastructure wants to fund and what the president wants to fund. What he is hoping and what his plan is based on is that for every dollar the federal government puts in there, state governments, local governments, and private businesses will put in money too. And that's where you hear that 1 trillion, 1.5 trillion, 1.7 billion of investment comes from. He's expecting that 200 billion to leverage that. However, on the same day that the White House released the Trump infrastructure plan, they also released their version of a Trump budget for 10 years. And when you put the two together, we're actually seeing a decrease of funding in infrastructure. So for instance, in the Trump budget, He says that for transportation spending, we should go back to just what the gas tax funds. So that would be a cut. He would cut things like Tiger. He would cut Amtrak. He would cut a bunch of transit services. So he's decreasing funding on infrastructure in the budget while pushing this $200 billion. But in the end, we get a negative. So what do we need to know about the policy within the Trump infrastructure plan? Going to go to the bottom of the slide. That funding is divided into 4 buckets. There's innovative grants for 100 billion, rural grants for 50 billion, transformative grants for 10 billion, and then there's a bunch of loan programs and tax incentives for business that make up the other 15. So when you look at the biggest pot of money, those innovative grants, that 100 billion, the Trump plan sets out some criteria for that, but the #1 criteria is how much money can that applicant bring to the table. So how much money can the state government bring to the table to fund a plan, or the local government, or how much private money can they get? And in fact, under that infrastructure grant program, the federal government will only fund 20% at the most. Right now, for most transportation projects, it's the reverse. The federal government brings in 80% and the local brings in 20%. So this is a huge switch to that. And there's a lot of stakeholders, a lot of state and local governments are really concerned about that. For us, I think the biggest problem is that we don't think transportation funding decisions should be made based on how much money you bring to the table. That flies in the face of Congress's push for a performance-based transportation system. And we agree with Congress on this one. We think that projects applying for federal funding for transportation should be judged on, do they improve safety? Do they improve better access? Do they improve the efficiency of the transportation system? So that's the basics on the Trump infrastructure plan. At the end of this presentation, I have some slides that go into more detail, and I will pass those on to you after the webinar. So getting into what we want in a transportation infrastructure plan. We support Congress's plan for a performance-based transportation system. And we think it should prioritize, first of all, safety. And here's some facts. I'm going to give you some arguments as I go through these slides. When you get to the summit, you will get a fact sheet that has all of these facts on it. So you don't feel like you need to take notes. You'll have all this with you. But one, over 40,000 people died on US roads last year. That's too many. All of those deaths are preventable. We also know that the US is far from first on road safety. Per capita, Americans die on the roads at twice the rate of Canadians and 4 times the rate of citizens of Great Britain. So we think safety should be a priority. We think multimodal projects and programs and planning should be a priority. The League, we have always stood for building complete streets so that when the street is planned and designed and built, it's built with consideration of all users, all modes of transportation. And so in a city like Washington, D.C., that may mean bike lanes and sidewalks. In a rural area, that might mean shoulders on the road. In a really quiet neighborhood, that might just mean a slow speed limit. But we do think that when we're building a project, we should be efficient and build it for everyone who's going to use it. We also, for a long time, have supported local control. And that's the idea of pushing decision-making down to local governments, at least for small projects, for projects within their communities. Because we believe local government should know those needs better The states are really good at building roads from community to communities, but within communities, we think that those local governments should know the needs better and they should be listening to their constituents better. So 2 more things we want as priorities in an infrastructure plan. We think it should prioritize building networks and fixing network gaps. So when you think about bicycling, I'm sure you can all think about someplace you would like to bike to. Maybe it's only a couple of miles away, and 90% of that ride is fine, but there's one major road that you just don't feel like you can get across safely, or maybe you have to cross a bridge that doesn't have bicycle infrastructure and it just doesn't feel safe, so you end up doing something else. Things like that, things like those network gaps, it would be much more efficient if we focused in on fixing those gaps, whether it's for biking or walking or driving or transit. And so we really think that that efficiency of building networks and fixing network gaps should be a priority. That would make, yeah. And there's better data that's now available to do that, and we'll talk about that in one of our other asks. We also would like to see the government invest in resilient infrastructure. We think that, you know, the EPA in 2017, so the Trump administration EPA, released a report saying that if we build infrastructure to withstand the weather and the extreme weather events and storms that we expect to see in 20 or 30 years, that could save us over 80% of the cost of repairs and maintenance on those roads versus if we just build them like we would now. So whether that's flooding or hurricanes or wind damage, we think building those the right way is more efficient and will save us funding in the future. It also will make evacuations easier for people using all modes. And we do think biking and walking has a role to play in storm mitigation and recovery. And so this is a step into that. All right, so the ask. So because this ask on the Trump infrastructure plan, it's a little more complicated than, say, just asking them to co-sponsor a bill, which we've done in the past. So I'm suggesting that you do this as a conversation with the goal both to share the priorities that we just went over, but also to learn what their priorities are. So, and we'll give you a handout on this too. But one of the things to ask is, what do you think of the Trump infrastructure plan? Have a conversation. And then what are the representatives or what are the senators' priorities for transportation in any infrastructure plan? Have a conversation. And then say, here's what we would like to see in the plan. And again, we'll have a fact sheet so you can go over these. And as you say, you know, we think safety should be a priority. Does the representative also believe that safety should be a priority for infrastructure spending? What about multimodal projects? We think that's a priority. Do you think it's a priority? And I'm asking you to go through these 5 and write down those answers, because that research will go a long way when if we're trying to affect votes in the future. So that'd be really important. So please do take notes on that. And then the final ask is, will the representative support a plan with these principles? Now, to help you do that in your meetings, you will get this fact sheet with the red top on your left. This is a fact sheet for you to leave behind when you're in the office, to pull out when you're in the office and walk through these. So you can, if you can see, it says make safety a priority, prioritize multimodal projects, boom, boom, boom. It's got those 5 there. So you can even just talk from this paper and leave it with them. On the other side, you will get a black and white piece of paper. This is a private explainer talking about why I think it's so important for us to be talking about the infrastructure plan right now, to talk about what the ask is. And that I'm hoping that you will keep to yourself. Excuse me. You know, if you leave it in office, it's not the worst thing, but this is more of a cheat sheet for you. I also wanted to talk through some potential questions, and these are also on that fact sheet. But for instance, if they ask you, what do you think of the Trump infrastructure plan? The way I would answer that for the league is I would say that we disagree with defunding the Tiger program, because that has funded harder to fund multimodal projects. We would disagree with Trump's plan to base grants on who comes to the table with the most money. We would support a performance-based system, just like Congress does. Some other questions, and this is where it gets tricky. You know, if they say, well, how do you think we should fund infrastructure? One answer you can give is that the league supports increasing the gas tax for a plan that supports these principles. And you can also say, specifically, we'd rather see that funding in Tiger than in this plan. One of the questions that comes up on the Hill when we're talking about funding infrastructure is people ask about, shouldn't bikes pay in? Shouldn't we put a tax on bikes? Here's, you know, I think you probably all have an answer to this question. I'm going to give you my answer for now, which is that most bicyclists also drive. We'd support raising the gas tax, and we would pay in that way. The other thing, and this is research that I have done with the Senate Finance Committee, is that heavy trucks, they pay taxes on their tires. It's based on the size of their tires to be based on the wear and tear that those trucks do to the road. And if bicycles were taxed, or bicyclists were taxed at an equivalent rate based on the wear and tear that bikes do to the roads, then the revenue they would bring in, it wouldn't even cover the cost of administering the tax. So that's the argument I have here. Instead of taking on directly the issue of should we pay a tax, I sort of say it doesn't work. You may have other answers. That's okay. I would suggest, though, if you're in that meeting, try to stick on one answer, one line of thinking. Don't start saying, well, we shouldn't pay because we help with congestion, and we shouldn't pay because we don't use gas, or we don't, you know, just pick one and go with one. And if it gets too crazy, or you're not sure what to say, just say, listen, I'll have a league representative follow up with you. And that's fine. Just let me know, and I will go in and talk to that office. All right. So with that, I think I'll stop and see if there's any questions. All right, I do not see any. And you can go ahead and write them in as we get going. We'll have time for some more later. So now I want to talk about funding Tiger.
Karen, this is Amelia. I see one question I can read out loud to you.
Oh, okay, great. Thanks, Amelia.
Sure. It's what if bike tax is left to local areas specifically protected to add bicycle infrastructure? What if bike tax is left to local areas specifically protected to add to bicycle infrastructure?
Okay, so here's one of the questions, and we can, as many of you know, Oregon just passed a tax on bikes, and I think we have to see how that goes and see if there's lessons learned from that. One of the concerns I have with a tax on bikes is that the large majority, I think 80% of bikes that are sold are $100 or less. And so the money that you raise from the tax would not be enough, would be a fraction of what is now spent on biking and walking infrastructure. And there's a real concern that they would just create their own fund and say only the money that comes in from a tax on bikes can be used for biking and walking. So that is one concern. Yeah, so I would say maybe I wouldn't get too much into the weeds on that in your congressional offices, because we could do a whole webinar just on that. I would really stick to the idea that we pay the gas tax, we'll pay in that way. We really just don't do that much wear and tear on the road. So you can go down. All right, we've got a, I can now see we got a couple more questions. Let me see if I can. Please explain the importance of Tiger. Okay, good question, Tom. I'm just about to go there. I have another question about feeling a little nervous about Lobby Day. What's the most effective use of the research? So I think the most effective use of that is to try to find something where you can connect to the member of Congress. If they've shown interest in health, talk about health. If you don't find something, try talking about economic benefits of biking. And you can shoot me an email and I can get you some arguments about that. So you could do that because everyone cares about the economy. So with that, I'm going to switch back to Tiger. And at the end of Tiger, I'll stop and take a few questions again. But thanks for the questions. All right. So Tiger is a grant program that was started in 2009 in the stimulus bill. Tiger is an acronym for Transportation Investment Generating Economic Recovery. But everyone knows it as Tiger, so you don't need to worry about spelling that out. It was originally created by Senator Murray, who is a Democrat from Washington, and Senator Collins, who is a Republican from Maine. And the goal of this program was really to fund projects that are harder to fund under formula funding. So the way most transportation funding works is there's a big formula based on number of road miles and all of that. And so states basically get X number of dollars to use on safety every year, and X number of dollars to use on transportation alternatives, and X number of dollars to work on congestion mitigation and air quality. And it goes out this way, and it goes out that way. What Tiger did was it brought in this idea of a competitive grant program. And it said, we're going to try to fund the things that are harder to fund. So multi-jurisdictional projects. So bridges that connect Maine to New Hampshire was one of them. And that's a project that neither Maine nor New Hampshire wanted to fund on their own, but together through this program, they could fund that. It also puts a real emphasis on multimodal projects. So we saw a lot of, like, whenever they put a bridge in, like that one between New Hampshire and Maine, the US DOT at the time said, hey, you got to make sure that there's access for biking and walking on it as well. We've seen a lot of transit stations that were built with this that also include safe access to get to the transit station, and then a place, safe parking there as well. So we saw a lot of those multimodal things. The other thing it did, which is different from the formula funding, is most of that formula funding just goes directly to the state DOT, and then the state DOT decides what projects to fund. Under Tiger, a city or a town or a county, a local government, could apply for a project that they need in their community and, I guess, bypass the state, but also go directly there. Even when we talk about local control and federal funding, that generally goes to the metropolitan area, but Tiger goes directly to the city or the community, or it can. So those are two of the real benefits that we saw from Tiger. Okay. Again, it's a discretionary grant program, so it's competitive. The criteria that was set up under Secretary LaHood back in 2009 safety, state of good repair, economic development, and environmental sustainability and quality of life. And so you can see on those years, biking and walking did pretty good. They got 4.3% of the funding. But so you know, in general, we get less than 2% of the funding. So this was more than double the percentage we get of Tiger funding. And that's why it's really great for biking and walking. But Tiger often gets caught up in the budget battles. Tiger is not covered under the FAST Act. It's not under the Highway Trust Fund. The funding comes out of general funds. So that means they have to decide the funding every year. And for several years, for the last several years, you know, under President Obama, it was in his budget. Then the House would either cut the funding or they would change the eligibilities or they'd just zero it out. And then the Senate would come back and say, we want $500 million for it. And Senator Collins, who is the senator from Maine, she chairs that committee. So she's got the bargaining power to get it back. And the House just cuts it so they can get something back in return. It's a bargaining chip. But it's ended up at that $500 million for the last several years. But this year was a little bit different. We saw President Trump's budget zeroed it out. The House zeroed it out. Senator Collins put it back at $550 million. But it was a little bit different this year because there were huge cuts to the House budget. So we weren't sure where that funding would come back from because it has to compete with everything in the housing and urban development sphere as well. So we were really worried about that. However, that budget deal that was signed into law this month between Schumer and McConnell, that included a lot more money. It also included $10 billion for infrastructure. And of course, that billion has to be cut across all of these different uses. But we would like to see some of that go to Tiger. Now, the White House has said, even with the higher numbers, they still want to zero out Tiger. They want that money to pay for their infrastructure package. And they defunded Tiger in fiscal year 2018, which was what that budget bill was about that comes up on March 23rd. But also they want to defund Tiger for the year after that. So our big ask for that is, will the senator support funding for Tiger in the 2018 and 2019 budgets? And again, we'll have a fact sheet for you that has the debate. It will have your talking points. And then the ask at the bottom. So I'm going to give folks a minute to see if you have any questions on Tiger. In the meantime, I have a question from George. It says, what about getting the bicycle commuter tax credit? What about getting that back? Great question, George. We are working on that, but right now, because they passed the tax bill, there's no appetite for doing a tax bill right away. And there's also, it's just very difficult right now to get Republicans and Democrats on the same bill. So we are working on that. We're going to try to get that back in the next few months. We just couldn't do it in time for the summit. But thanks for that question. All right, any other questions on Tiger? All right, thanks for hanging with me, everybody. Okay. A couple of questions you might get. Why shouldn't that funding just go through normal transportation programs? We'd say, number one, Tiger funds projects that are hard to fund, such as those bridges between states, but also because they allow local governments to apply directly. They may ask, why shouldn't we just put this money towards the infrastructure plan? And I think we can say Tiger's a competitive program, that it's had great results, and is consistent with the performance measures that Congress has laid out, including state safety and state of good repair. We really want to push on that Congress has performance measures. Let's stay with those performance measures. And that will make an argument for Tiger. Okay. So one more ask. This is for the House Bill 4241, the Transportation Access and System Connection Ask. The goal of this bill of 4241 is to improve transportation planning by giving states and MPOs better data and what's called access data. It was introduced by 4 members of Congress, Elizabeth Esty from Connecticut, who will be speaking at the summit, Rodney Davis from Illinois, Dan Lipinski from Illinois, and Barbara Comstock from Virginia. So we've got 2 Democrats, 2 Republicans. All 4 of them are on the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee. And so this bill really has a chance of moving through. We're most likely to see it get attached to something like an infrastructure plan or the next reauthorization coming up next Congress. We also say we are also working on a companion bill for this in the Senate, but just couldn't quite get it together by the summit. So what is access data? What does it mean to measure access? So the data that states usually get, we consider mobility data, where they look at one specific point, like an intersection, and they measure travel speed, the level of service for vehicles, and sort of the number of vehicles or persons that pass through for a given time. But access data really wants to look at your ability to travel between a place of origin and an everyday destination. And so instead of one point, it's a whole bunch of different points. For cars, that's looking at the road network, how well can you get from A to B. Transit, it's looking at the routes and the stations. And for biking and walking, it's also looking for those connections, but it's also looking at the facilities, the road types, the condition of that road. So to me, this is really exciting. This idea of this data. What 4241 does is it creates a pilot project to provide that data to 5 states and to 10 metropolitan areas or metropolitan planning organizations. 4 of those may be really big areas with a population of 200,000 or greater, and 6 of them with populations less than 200,000. The bill leaves it up to the U.S. Department of Transportation to create criteria for and select the states and MPOs that get the data. The U.S. Department of Transportation will purchase the data and then report back to Congress on how that data was used. The reason it's a pilot project that goes to the 5 states and the 10 MPOs is because what the co-sponsors did is they just want to get the data out the door, but any bill that has a price tag to it is much harder to pass. So what they said is, for this number of states and MPOs, it's going to cost about 500, I think 500,000, they said. So that is doable within US DOT administration funds. And so this way, this bill doesn't add any new cost, which makes it a lot easier to push it through. Here's an idea of how it's used. This is an example from Madison, Wisconsin. The route in the middle is Route 12 or 18. To the north of that route, you have a residential area, a middle class and lower middle class up there. To the south, you have a lot of jobs and services and businesses. But if you're on a bike, you can't really cross that. So they were looking at creating a bike connection, a Perry Street bike connection that would take you over the road. And they wanted to know, okay, how many people now have access to that business? So they made a couple of assumptions. They assumed that most people could not cross the nearby highway exchanges on a bike, that it's not safely bikeable. They assumed a very moderate bicycling speed of 8.5 miles per hour, gives you plenty of time to stop for red lights. And it took into account biking conditions such as the speed of the roads, the traffic, number of lanes, the type of road, and modeled that. So this is what you're looking at. This blue map is the before picture. And this is measuring businesses' access to households. So you can see that area south of what would be the Perry extension, it's much lighter. They have less access to households by bike. But then they said, okay, if we put in this Perry extension, how will that access improve? And what it showed is that if you put that in that area A where all those businesses are, they will have increased access to households. So within a 15-minute bike ride, almost 6,000 households will now have access to the shops, jobs, and other opportunities. And that if you, within a 30-minute bike ride, you have over 20,000 households gain access. So that's a real big difference, and that helps you measure those things versus just looking at the roads and saying, oh, nobody's biking here. And I think this would really help in terms of creating a bikeability score. You know, we've seen a walking score. This would create a bikeability score. So the ask is for the representative to co-sponsor 4241. I was hopeful that we would have a Senate bill. We don't yet. You'll have this handout. This is a leave behind handout. You can see the red one will give you the background, what the bill does, why we think it matters, and where the offices need to go to co-sponsor. On the back is a very short write-up of that example I just gave you. All right, so let's see. Some questions. Questions on how to pay for it. It comes out of the US DOT administrative budget. And if they balk at that, you can say, well, you know what? The US DOT pays for other data for states. They give them congestion data right now, which is much more expensive than this data. And I think we can argue that this kind of accessibility data could be more helpful. And if they ask about how the states and MPOs will be chosen, that would be up to the US DOT. The authors of this bill, the sponsors, they really wanted to make this as simple as possible to get that data out there. All right. So I'm going to check for questions. We went one too far. See if we have some more questions. Yeah. So we had a question of, if your representative's area is rural, how will this pilot project eventually translate to benefiting their districts? Well, that's a good question. So in rural areas, so that question was within a 15-minute bike ride. If you think in a rural area about adding shoulders to a rural highway, how will that increase access? You know, especially for if you've got families that have one car or there's not a lot of transit sometimes in some rural areas, there may be options for creating bike routes. In rural areas, a trail versus just an on-road facility, a trail that might actually increase access faster. And that's something that you couldn't measure just on the road system, but you may be able to measure with this data moving forward. And then we have a question, who would typically provide this data? That's a good question. We're seeing more and more companies get into this. One company is City Labs. It's City with an I, not a Y. So not the media group, CITI Labs. And they have a program called Sugar Access. So you can look that up online. We will also have someone from Sugar Access at the summit who can answer some more questions about this data. I will say there are a few places and a few states. I know Delaware uses this data, and I think Utah uses the data. So that question, Ted, about rural areas might be a good question to talk to Matt from Sugar Data about. All right, it's getting late, but I want to just give you a preview of what other handouts will be in your package. in your lobby packet. So when you first get into your Hill meetings, we talked about introducing yourself, keeping it short, 1 or 2 questions, who you are. And then we want to make sure you can take some time to talk about bicycling in your state. Maybe when you're at the summit and we're in our state meetings, that would be a great time to sort of talk about who's going to take the lead, choose a fact sheet to make a point, and then you can get into the asks that we just went through, and also an invite to the reception. So what kind of individual state data will we have? We'll have a couple of them. Again, this is look through these before the meeting. A lot of this is online, so you can look at it there. We do have a couple of these. You don't have to spend time on all of them, but if you can find one sort of fact or one nugget that's going to help you talk about bicycling in your community, or maybe relate to one of the issues you're going to talk about when you make the ask, that would be really great. Excuse me. So the first is a Bicycle Friendly America Awards. And these are all on the website. We'll have the communities, the businesses, and the universities, and we'll have what district they're in. So I would say, you know, look for your district, especially when you're going into a House office, or if you're going into a state office, if there's a really big business, if there's a hospital or something like that, maybe you want to point that out. You know, say, hey, if there's something that's new that you know is new and you want to talk about that, that would be great. There's not something from your district, but there's something from a neighboring district, or maybe a different town that you compete with a little bit. It's a great time to maybe point that out. In some of them, if you follow Amelia on Twitter, she just had a tweet out today about what percentage of a state lives in a bicycle-friendly community. And so some of that may be really interesting to know. It's a way to show that how bicycling is gaining in popularity. We'll also have your bicycle-friendly states report card from last year. A couple of things to point out. These feedback points on them. These are things that in most cases were the league worked with the local advocacy group to reinforce some of the things that you've all been working on in your state. So something like that might be interesting, especially if they're asking you about what's happening in this state. There's also information in here that compares it to other states. So this is Maryland, and Virginia is ahead of Maryland. And so that might be a good competitive thing to say, like, hey, we got to get ahead of Virginia. Having funding like Tiger could really help us do that. You know, if depending on where you are on safety, you could be like, look, this is why we really think that the infrastructure plan should prioritize safety, because we have a real biking, walking safety issue in our state. On the other side, you'll also see there's a lot more information about what's going on in your state. If you can pick something that's your state's doing really well on, maybe like, hey, our state has this complete streets policy, is working really well. This is why we really need funding for multimodal projects so that our state can keep doing what it wants to do. Again, safety is a big one, planning, any of these things that make sense to relate back to those infrastructure principles that we talked about. The third handout, and this is new, all of that Bicycle Friendly America information is available on the web at bikeleague.org/BFA, so you can look that up. These transportation alternative annual reports, this is something new. This is something that we lobbied on in 2015. We got it, we won. It is now required under the FAST Act. And it requires that every year the state has to report back how many applications they got for transportation alternative projects, the aggregate cost of all of those applications, the number of projects selected, and the aggregate cost of selected projects. So 2016 was the first year, so we have some of that data. And the message it helps us show is that the demand for biking and walking projects is much higher than the funding this program gives. And you also see that most of that funding is spent on biking and walking, whether it's specifically biking and walking projects, whether it's considered a recreational project, or whether it's considered safe routes to school. So this is an example of what it looks like. This is Nevada. One thing I want to point out that's highlighted here in yellow is that this is a snapshot in time, and that as we get more data, we'll be able to talk about it more. But I wanted to get this out there because I wanted you to see that what happens when you come to Lobby on Hill Days, we get this out there. But I also think it's important for the Hill offices to see how big that demand is. On the circles on the front line, in 2016, for the whole country, there was $835 million available. That's for the whole country. And not including the projects that were funded, just the ones that weren't funded on the bottom there, that connected circle, over $1.5 billion, almost twice as much in unfunded projects from what we got total. The other thing you can do, it says on average, states were not able to fund 49 or basically half of their applications. And so here in Nevada, you could say, we're even worse than average. You know, we even wanted more and couldn't get it. So I think this will be a good opportunity to show folks, because a lot of people, particularly in the Senate offices, if they hear from their DOT, they hear that these projects aren't the top priority. But when you look at these sheets, you can see that if it's not the top priority for the state to build them, there's definitely a pent-up demand for it from the communities. All right, so those are the slides. Those are the handouts you'll get. You will see those all on Tuesday afternoon when you break into your state groups. I have some more time for those of you who have some more questions. We can go through some now. And then I'll send these to you, and there will be a recording of this webinar on our website. So I got a question. What is the invite to the reception? So every year after Hill Day, we have a reception on Capitol Hill. This is a great time to, I love the reception because everyone comes back from their meetings and they've all had these great meetings, and I love hearing about them. It's a last time to celebrate having been in Washington, have a drink, have some appetizers. We get some members of Congress who come and say a few remarks. If you Google the YouTube of LaHood standing on the table, that was when LaHood was Secretary of Transportation, and he stood on a table at the reception and gave this really great speech. It's a really good time, and we would love to have the staffers come there. We also get some members of Congress. So it's your chance to invite them to come join us. All right, great. Any other questions? Oh, I think we got one. Oh, I got to thank you. So yeah, thanks all of you for joining, and look forward to seeing you next week. If you have any questions in between now and then, my email's on the slide, caron@bikeleague.org. All right, with that, I'll say good night. Thanks again.